Welcome to the untold story of heart disease. I'm your host, Matt Carter. Thanks for joining me as I take you on a journey of uncovering the true cause of the #1 killer worldwide, heart disease. Responsible for 1 in 3 deaths, it kills more people each year than all forms of cancer combined. And over the age of 40, the risk rises dramatically. High blood pressure, stress, obesity, diabetes, they're all serious risk factors. Every 2 seconds, somebody in the world falls victim. But what's most frightening is that many people have no idea they even have heart disease until they die from it. In approximately 50% of cases, the first sign of heart disease is sudden death. Children lose their parents, years of marriage abruptly ending in a matter of seconds. However, what's more disturbing is that what most people think causes heart disease may be far from accurate. A growing number of experts who you'll hear from in this series are sounding the alarm and warning people that what we've been told about the cause of heart disease may not be true. Many of these experts claim the actual causes have been known for years, with the science to prove it, but it's largely ignored by mainstream. What they reveal is both shocking and controversial, yet it's also very liberating at the same time. Having lost a number of my own family and friends to heart disease, and with many more medicated for cholesterol and blood pressure, I just wanted to know the truth. And being a husband and a father, I want to do everything that I can to ensure I'm around to support my family. You see, before setting out on this worldwide mission to find out the truth about heart disease, I was unwell. 35 pounds overweight, I suffered from painful joints, severe headaches, constant ringing in my ears, burning reflux disorder, elevated blood pressure, and to top it all off, I got diagnosed with cancer. For years, my wife urged me to address my health, but to my shame, I didn't listen. I had plenty of warning signs, but I foolishly ignored them all, and it took a major health scare to snap me out of my delusion and start taking responsibility for my own health. Thankfully, now I'm in the best shape of my life because I learned to address the root cause of my problems. And I personally wasn't satisfied with the answers that I was getting from my doctor, largely coming in the form of prescriptions. I found it frustrating that my typical doctor's visit lasted only about 10 minutes, and they never seemed to ask much about my diet or lifestyle, with my queries about getting to the cause of my ailments usually receiving a vague answer, often involving something to do with just getting older. This wasn't enough for me. I wanted to get to the root cause and actually fix my problems. And with heart disease being a major issue running in my family, I decided to do my own research. And I spent 2 years tracking down the best integrative heart disease experts that I could find that had a proven track record to match. I personally interviewed over 40 of these experts, and it quickly dawned on me that mainstream's view on heart disease in all its forms, such as high blood pressure and cholesterol, heart attacks, strokes, is all missing the mark. Some even claiming this is due to powerful corporate influence over health. However, not everything mainstream believe is misguided. Smoking, for example, is clearly bad for heart disease, as is stress. But unfortunately, there are key areas where mainstream fall down, which many experts in this series reveal has enormous consequences. As you watch this series, you'll hear these experts reveal a number of hidden dangers they claim are the true drivers of heart disease. And the scary thing is that most people are exposing themselves to these dangers on a daily basis. You probably won't hear these things from your local doctor, but it's not their fault, as they're not being told this stuff either. Whether you currently have heart disease, or have already suffered a heart attack or a stroke, or maybe you have high blood pressure or cholesterol, or a poor blood flow related condition like erectile dysfunction or painful extremities, or perhaps you too have a family history of heart disease and just want to do everything you can to avoid it. Whatever your reason is, make sure you watch this entire series as we get to the root cause, covering many important topics such as cholesterol, eating fat, statin drugs, high blood pressure, food addiction, weight loss, diabetes, and more, all while revealing the true cause of heart disease. I believe what you'll learn in this series will not only empower you to stay healthy and potentially avoid a health crisis, you'll be in the position to share this knowledge with your family and friends who may need it too. Thanks for joining me on this quest to learn the truth as together we hear the untold story of heart disease. Let's begin our journey.
So there are millions of people with established heart disease, roughly 16 million in the US, for example. But if you think about people who are at risk, we're talking about probably half the population. So the studies show that about a third of all people in westernized societies will suffer a heart attack or stroke as their cause of death. 1 out of 3 of us is walking around with some significant risk or significant disease already. Among all the diseases of all the Western societies, heart disease is by far number 1. It kills more people per year than all cancers combined. People don't often realize that, and unfortunately, there's a lot more focus sometimes on certain cancers that are important but don't claim as many lives as heart disease. And I think sometimes the message gets lost when people are hyper-focusing on a disease that's becoming less and less common.
Women are not spared. For women as well, cardiovascular disease claims 500,000 lives a year versus breast cancer, which claims maybe 46,000, depending on where we're looking in countries and so on. So much bigger problem for women.
Well, I was in great shape and I exercised regularly. I was a competitive bodybuilder. I had a healthy diet, and on record, I have perfect blood pressure. I've never smoked, no family history of heart disease, no diabetes. My cholesterol profile was very good. And I awakened one middle of the night with heartburn. I thought it was heartburn, to make a long story short. Ended up in the hospital the next day after 12 hours of saying, this can't be my heart. And I write about this in my book. But here I'm in Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, and I'm in the throngs of what they call a stuttering heart attack.
If you really want to know why heart disease rates all over the world are skyrocketing and what you can do to prevent it, then why not join our Heart Disease Code program today? The program is the most comprehensive heart disease prevention program anywhere. Included in the program is the 9 Steps to Fight and Prevent Heart Disease book, which covers many important topics such as high blood pressure, cholesterol, heart attacks, strokes, erectile dysfunction, and more. Plus, get full access to the Untold story of heart disease documentary series. The series contains over 10 hours of interviews with more than 40 natural health experts, including world-leading cardiologists, doctors, scientists, and researchers who reveal how to fight and prevent heart disease. Each episode comes with a companion guide with short quizzes to accelerate your learning, along with dozens of delicious recipes, our top 50 foods for heart health, and a guide for the best supplements to take and what test you should ask your doctor for. All this and more can be yours just by clicking the link in the description below.
If you look at the risk for first heart attack, half the people who have a heart attack have no symptoms prior to their heart attack. And it can be higher depending on whether you're male or female. Some of the statistics, actually 65% of men have their first heart attack before any symptoms occur. They drop dead, end of story.
Anybody is at risk for a heart attack. It happened to me, and I was the least likely. When I was at Cedars-Sinai, they said, you can't have a heart attack. I was like the least likely person to have it. It can happen to anyone. A month after my heart attack, which was very mild, fortunately, my nurse at the time had a massive stroke in church on Christmas Eve, and subsequently passed. So this could happen to anyone, any gender, any socioeconomic class. So we have to always keep that in mind. It's still the #1 killer in this country and in the Western world.
They die in their sleep, or they just drop dead at work. And it's really tragic because those are avoidable. All we needed was to find out if they had risk, and we could have addressed that risk.
In episode 1, we go back to where things went horribly wrong for heart disease. The fork in the road, where the wrong path was chosen. You're about to hear the fascinating and disturbing story of one highly persuasive man whose dominating character enabled him to affect health policy for the worse across the entire Western world. When we share what you're about to learn with people, the most common response is, how could this possibly happen? It is hard to believe, but it's true. For decades, we've been told to decrease consumption of fat as it clogs arteries like a blocked kitchen sink. Men, women, children, all of us. But what if the science was never there to support this theory in the first place? Humans have been eating fat for millennia, yet heart disease has only been a concern for the past 100 years. And since the inception of the low-fat movement, there's been an explosion of poor health across the world. Your fork is potentially the most powerful device for health that you have. What you put on the end of it really does matter. We all need to ask critical questions and never be bullied when it comes to the health and well-being of your family. In episode 1, you'll learn the facts on fat and heart disease.
Well, the story really begins in the 1950s when, in the US, the nation was in a real panic about the rising tide of heart disease that had come from pretty much out of nowhere in the early 1900s to be the #1 killer in the nation. President Eisenhower himself had a heart attack in 1955 and was out of office for 10 whole days. And nobody knew what causes heart disease. And there were a number of competing theories. Some people said it was vitamin deficiency, others said it was the rising amount of auto exhaust, others said it was a type A personality, too much stress. But there was one theory proposed by a physiologist named Ancel Keys from the University of Minnesota, and it was his idea that it was saturated fat and dietary cholesterol that would clog your arteries, like oil down a cold stovepipe, and that would give you a heart attack. That was called the diet heart hypothesis, and that is where the whole story began.
If you go back into the 50s and 60s, there was an appreciation that there was a problem with heart attacks. And nobody really knew the etiology of these events. And one of the early theories was because you could identify cholesterol crystals in the atherosclerotic plaque, that maybe cholesterol was causative of it. So that was the initial theory, that cholesterol actually caused atherosclerosis.
Ancel Keys was able to get his idea implanted into the American Heart Association. And in 1961, the American Heart Association comes out with the first ever advice anywhere in the world to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol to prevent heart attacks. That was the beginning of all the advice that we have all over the world today. It really started with the American Heart Association. What was the evidence at the time? There was really just one study that Ancel Keys himself had done called the 7-country study. I looked into that study in great detail because it's so incredibly important. It's like the big bang of nutrition science. If you read 10,000 studies on nutrition, as I unfortunately have done, they all telescope back to this 7-country study. So it's incredibly important. That study was done on nearly 13,000 men in 7 countries, mainly in Europe, but also in the US and Japan. And it followed them, looked at what they ate, measured their cholesterol, and then followed them to see who died of a heart attack or something else. What Ancel Keys found in that study was what he had hoped to find because he was already completely invested in this hypothesis. He found that people who didn't eat as much saturated fat seemed to have a less of a risk for dying of a heart attack. There were so many problems with this study when I looked into it. I mean, first of all, it's a kind of study that can only show association. It can't show cause and effect. That's just a basic problem with this kind of science. So these people, maybe they didn't eat that much saturated fat, but what else were they not eating a lot of? They weren't eating a lot of sugar, it turned out. Could it have been the sugar? Was it the saturated fat? In this kind of study, you never know the answer to that question.
The story of Ancel Keys and how this all went wrong, there are so many ways to talk about this. Poor Ancel Keys has been demonized by the people in our neck of the woods in terms of medicine, functional medicine and nutrition, and probably with some good cause. He was the person who gave us the low-fat diet, indirectly, but he gave us the low-fat diet. He gave us the notion of fat and cholesterol clogging our arteries and of these things actually causing heart disease. The story of how he got that notion to be accepted from the health authorities like the American Heart Association is such a rich tale of intrigue and personality and influence and politics. It's a remarkable study, but it's a study more in social psychology than it is in nutrition.
Ancel Keys definitely did a lot of harm to our society by convincing people that they should be on a low-fat diet. It's a devastating idea, and it's just I suspect that it tied into the fact that they had discovered these statin drugs, and they knew they would have a market for the drugs if they could convince people that cholesterol was bad, that you could lower the LDL with the drug. And so if you just knew the LDL was bad, you would do that. You would be willing to do that. So I suspect it was kind of a marketing scheme on their part to try to convince people to take statin drugs.
And I think the entire 7 countries study, which is the foundation of our whole cholesterol mania and our fear of saturated fat and our low-fat diet, all comes from the 7 country study, was really designed as a revenge study. Here's what happened. In 1955, Ancel Keys, who had decided, and we can talk about why he decided this, and it's a very interesting story, but he had decided that the real cause of the heart disease epidemic that everybody believed we were experiencing was saturated fat intake and cholesterol in the blood. He believed that blood cholesterol was the ultimate indicator of risk for heart disease. And he believed that the ultimate demon in the diet was saturated fat because he believed it consistently raised cholesterol. Therefore, if cholesterol causes heart disease, saturated fat is the determinant of the thing that causes. And he was convinced of this. And there's a notion in psychology called motivated cognition. It means you look, but you have an agenda and you hope the facts are going to come out a certain way. You're kind of motivated to see something or not see something because you have it's also called confirmation bias. So he, in 1955, he goes before the World Health Organization. He presents this chart of 6 countries. And he says, look at this chart. The more fat they eat, the more heart disease they have. They laughed at him. They criticized him, they laughed at him, they said, what's your best piece of evidence for this crazy theory? They didn't say crazy theory, but that was the tone, and this is according to witnesses, by the way. Henry Blackburn, who was a colleague of Keys, has written about this, and they said, what's your best piece of evidence, Ancel? And he says, well, there's this, and they demolished it. He never got over that. So he said, I'll show these guys. I'm going to design a study that is going to be incontrovertible and is going to prove my point. So he did the 7-country study. He purposely chose 7 countries that would meet his criteria and show that relationship. Now, what's important to understand, as it has been shown subsequently, is there was actually data for 22 countries. And he just left out the ones that didn't conform to his hypothesis.
So there were other problems with the 7-country study. I mean, they only sampled the diets of fewer than 500 men, which was just a few percentage of the total population, which was not statistically significant. They had huge problems measuring what people ate. Trying to get people to tell you what they eat is almost impossible to do it accurately. And one of the little details that I found, which was just sort of emblematic of the problems that they had, was that in one of the 3 weeks that Keys went to Crete, the island of Crete, where seemed to be the most long-lived people who ate the least amount of saturated fat, they were like his star subjects. In one of the 3 weeks that he went to look at that population, he arrived during Lent, the strict Greek Orthodox Lent where you can't eat any kind of animal foods. So it's obvious that he undercounted the amount of saturated fat that these people were eating.
Don't be making any conclusions from this because all we're doing is showing associations. So I'd be very careful about making too many conclusions. We have done the opposite. We look at these association studies and we assume cause and effect. So it would be like looking at a fire and saying fire causes firemen, or firemen cause fires, or umbrellas cause rain. Lots of things are found together. There's a site called 538. It's Nate Silver and his team of incredible statisticians, and they actually put together a list of statistically significant correlations or associations, and they're hysterically funny. You know, like the number of ice cubes you use in a drink is correlated with the color of your eyes. There's all kinds of statistical associations that are even statistically significant, but meaningless. So you can't really draw these kind of causal conclusions from seeing that two things are associated with each other. And that's pretty much what they did.
Well, my opinion on Ansel Keys and the whole anti-saturated fat movement and the anti-cholesterol movement is that it is built on faulty data. It is built on information where Ansel Keys cherry-picked information that he thought fit the model that he wanted to create. Now, who funded him and what was behind him, and was it big agriculture, was it, these big food conglomerates that they said, hey, fat is bad, therefore you got to eat our sugary cereal in a box. That's maybe subject for another time to talk about conspiracy theory with that. But I will say this, is that when you look at the literature, for every person that was with Ansel Keys and his data, there was probably 20 doctors that were against Ansel Keys. So doctors like John Yudkin and others published a lot of information, but clearly when it went to the hands of the United States government, I believe that the United States government clearly was on the side of some of these big box food makers to say, hey, we can do some other things here that don't require refrigeration and have very long shelf lives, and now you get into the cereal and the grains and all the different farming practices that are going on now that clearly propagated that agenda.
I mean, one of the things to know about Ansel Keys is that Ansel Keys was a very domineering personality. Even his friends would say he will argue anyone to the death, and he is he's an aggressive individual. And it was really that force of personality that was able to get his idea into the American Heart Association and made it the founding idea for all of nutrition science, really through the 20th and still the 21st century.
And there's so many problems with the 7-country study. You could drive a Mack truck through the hole in that study. I mean, things that didn't add up as far as his theory went. For example, 2 population groups in Turkey with very, very different levels of heart disease. They ate the same amount of fat. He just ignored it. 2 islands in Greece where heart disease rates were wildly different, but fat intake was the same. Just ignored it. He actually did some of his measurements during, it was a Greek Orthodox country, and he did it during fasting times. I mean, it was just a horrible study, and it was an epidemiological study.
Health authorities and governments around the world really understood that the 7-country study was not enough. It was weak evidence, and everybody knew it. And so what happened in the 60s and 70s was that governments around the world undertook a more rigorous kind of science called randomized controlled clinical trials, which can show cause and effect. They tested more than 60,000 people on this idea that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. It's the most tested hypothesis in the history of nutrition science. And all of those studies taken together concluded that saturated fat had no effect on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality.
In fact, in around 1957, the American Heart Association put out a 16-page position paper in which they said there's no evidence that requires us to suggest to the American people that they change their diet. This low-fat stuff is not proven. There's some tentative associations. We do not endorse this. It's not our position. 4 years later, talk about dominating personalities, 4 years later, there was an ad hoc committee of the American Heart Association, which Ansel Keys was on, with a couple of his cronies, and they came out with a position paper, which was all of 2 pages long, saying the best scientific evidence, which they did not reference, definitely supports the idea that low fat is a better choice. How did he do that? I don't know. I mean, all I can think of is that there are extremely dominating personalities who managed to influence the organizations that they're in, and we have this sense now that everybody agreed, but they didn't.
George Mann was a biochemist at the University of Vanderbilt, and he was interested in what caused heart disease. And he went to Kenya and studied a tribe called the Maasai. They were in incredibly good health. He measured them, he took 400 electrocardiograms, and he couldn't find a trace of heart disease. And they had very low blood pressure, and importantly, as they get older, it didn't get worse. Their blood pressure didn't rise with age. Their cholesterol levels were very low and remained so as they got older. And he wanted to understand why they were so healthy. It was so different than what was seen at that time in Western populations. This was in the 1970s. Well, what did the Maasai eat? They ate a diet of meat, blood, and fat. That's it. And milk. Their diet was probably 60-70% fat, and much of that was saturated fat and very high in cholesterol. So this was contrary evidence to what Ancel Keys was proposing. I mean, according to Ancel Keys and all his colleagues, these Maasai warriors should have been dead from heart attacks. You know, they should not have been in perfect health. George Mann, he published this work in reputable journals. He looked into the possibility that maybe these Maasai warriors had some kind of special genetic protection, so he followed some of them to when they moved to the big city, and he discovered that in the cities, when they changed their diet to become more Western, that they did see their cholesterol rise and their blood pressure get worse, so he understood that it was not some unique genetic protection. George Mann discovered that in promoting his evidence, he was going up against the dominant hypothesis, right? So now Ancel Keys' hypothesis has been adopted by the American Heart Association, the National Institutes of Health. Everybody has adopted the diet heart hypothesis, and George Mann found himself a very lonely man.
George Mann, a name worth remembering, he was one of the top researchers on the Framingham study, which is the cornerstone of all of our thoughts about heart disease and diet, called the notion that cholesterol causes heart disease the greatest scam ever perpetrated on the American public.
I mean, one of the questions that I always get asked is, who are the critics? Where were the critics? How is it possible? It's not possible that one man, Ancel Keys, would drive a whole hypothesis. And of course, that's a fair question, because there were, in fact, many critics of Ancel Keys. There was, for instance, John Yudkin, who was a professor of nutrition in London, and it was his proposal that sugar was really driving heart disease. But Ancel Keys really shot down that hypothesis, and he did it in a way that really can almost be described as bullying. He would publish articles calling Yudkin names, like accusing him of being backed by commercial interests, and telling him that he didn't know anything about the data, and just denigrating him in the scientific literature. And this was, to anybody in science, it's such an affront to be attacked in this way. And it really had an effect on John Yudkin. He was really drummed out of the field ultimately, and gave up. And this, John Yudkin is not the only example. There are multiple examples of critics of Keys. Another one is Theodore Reiser, a tremendously well-respected professor at Texas A&M University, who wrote a critique of the idea that saturated fats cause heart attacks. He wrote a reasoned, I think very good, rigorous critique of Ancel Keys' hypothesis. Ancel Keys responded with a 20-plus page attack on Theodore Reiser, including calling him names, including calling him, accusing him of being backed again by some kind of financial interest. And I mean, the sorts of critiques that you really would expect on a playground almost, they're so just really rude name-calling kind of behavior. And you can be sure that Theodore Reiser never wrote again anything against Ancel Keys, because that's not normal in the scientific community to do that.
I usually, when I tell audiences about this, I use, unfortunately nobody is old enough to remember this because we all grew up with DVD players and things like that, but in the 80s, there were VHS players. And there were two kinds of VHS players, if you will. There was the VHS we all know and love that our parents used that had 12 o'clock flashing, and there was a competing system called Betamax by Sony. And the two lobbied. They all tried to get the most movie studios to work with them and to release movies on their format. And they tried to get the most manufacturers to make the kind of players that would play their stuff, either Betamax or VHS. And VHS ultimately won the battle of public relations and became the official format in the 80s until we went to streaming and all the rest of it. Here's the thing. If you go to any recording studio in the world and ask them what the best technology is, they will tell you Betamax was. by far, it was the better technology, but they didn't have a good ground game, so they lost. That's what happened with Ansel Keys and John Yudkin. The wrong theory won. John Yudkin had the answer right then. He had the fertile place we should have been looking for research. Ansel Keys had a better ground game, and we've been living with the results for 40 years.
There's another example of a critic of Ansel Keys was Pete Ahrens, one of the leading so-called lipidologists, which is somebody who studies fats from the Rockefeller University in New York City. He was a persistent critic of Ansel Keys, and also this idea that we should all adopt as policy Ansel Keys' idea to make it policy for everyone. He kept saying that evidence isn't there, we don't have enough evidence, the evidence is conflicting. I interviewed the students of Pete Ahrens who told me how that affected Ahrens' career. I mean, he stopped getting invited to expert conferences, he couldn't get his papers published, he lost his research grants, and it really caused his career to suffer. The outcome of attacking scientists with contrarian views is that scientists learn to self-censor. You know, when I interviewed scientists, many of them had learned, they see the example of people whose careers suffer, who speak out and suffer for it. And they themselves, they wouldn't talk to me, or they would say, I can't talk about that. Or they would tell me, and they would say, this is what I think, but I will never say that on the public record. Because they know that that would end their career.
As cholesterol levels became more routinely done, because they weren't originally, it became clear within a year that people coming into a hospital with a heart attack had significantly lower cholesterol levels than age-matched, sex-matched people without heart attacks. There was a big difference, not a little difference. So people with very high cholesterol, say in our units 300 or so, had far fewer heart attacks. They live longer and they're healthier. So the theory was a mess from those early years. And then in an effort to save the theory, a few things were done. They combined the cholesterol with animal fats, saying that, well, it's not just cholesterol, it's all these bad saturated animal fats. And that includes some of the best foods in the world. Like you could argue an egg is almost a perfect food. So the vilification of eggs and butter, and then the promotion of, seed oil-based margarines, it's all bad in terms of public health, and it was wrong, of course, but the theory still was falling flat, and that's when you saw the introduction of good and bad cholesterol, the HDL, LDL. Again, one is not morally bad and one's not morally good. They're different densities, they have different roles. That didn't hold water either, but and then most of the cholesterol trials, no, actually you could say all of the dietary interventions were a disaster. None of them had any benefit. If you make people eat a lot of polyunsaturated vegetable oils in place of healthy butter and natural fats, they're worse, they get sicker.
The whole notion of cholesterol clogging your arteries, and if you eat bacon grease, it goes right into the arteries and takes up residence there, is just nonsensical. It's not how the body works at all. It doesn't get transposed from the McDonald's plate into your arteries. But that image has been so embedded in our consciousness, it's almost like a meme, that it's very hard to erase that notion, that if you eat fat, you become fat, and that all this saturated fat, that's what it looks like in your arteries. And in fact, that's not true.
Well, we have long believed, and we've developed dietary policies that reflect the fact that fat and saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. And yet, it's based on very flimsy evidence. In fact, increasingly evidence is showing that dietary fat is not linked to heart disease in any way, that cholesterol is not linked, dietary cholesterol is not linked to heart disease. In fact, the US dietary guidelines in 2015 clearly removed dietary cholesterol as a, quote, nutrient of concern, meaning there's no longer any reason to restrict it because it has nothing to do with heart disease. And their answer was, well, we never really looked at the data very carefully. We just assumed because cholesterol is bad, that dietary cholesterol is bad, you should cut out eggs and shrimp and forget about it. The truth is that that was never studied. Same thing with saturated fat. there was some evidence based on population studies, looking at large populations over time, looking for patterns or correlations, that saturated fat seemed to be linked to heart disease through the work of Ansel Keys and the 7-country study. But that was just looking at patterns. It didn't prove cause and effect. And so when data actually came out that started to look at cause and effect studies, in fact, it was done by Ansel Keys himself and his colleague, they found that the group of 9,000 people that were divided into 2 groups, they were in mental institutions, and you couldn't do that study today. The group that had vegetable oil, corn oil, did far worse than the group that had saturated fat or butter in this large randomized controlled trial, which was done in the 1960s. And the data was never published because the authors didn't really like the conclusions, and it stayed buried for 40 years in a basement until researchers from the NIH, National Institutes of Health, uncovered the data, analyzed it, and found that, in fact, those people who had the saturated fat did better. In fact, if you took the vegetable oil, you lowered your cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, using these polyunsaturated fatty acids. And when you lowered your LDL cholesterol, your risk of heart disease went up by 22% for every 30-point drop in LDL, completely contradicting all of our other thinking about this. And then there's been 17 large meta-analyses of all the data, observational data, randomized trials, blood levels of fatty acids, all showing that there is no link between saturated fat, total fat, and heart disease. In fact, there's an inverse relationship with monounsaturated fats and omega-3 fats, and of course a positive correlation with trans fat or hydrogenated fats.
In 2010, there was a meta-analysis which was published in the Journal of Clinical Nutrition. The lead researcher was Siri-Tarino, and Ron Krauss, the great lipid biochemist from Children's Hospital in Oakland, was one of the researchers on this. And they did a meta-analysis of all these studies that looked at saturated fat, except they did not look at the surrogate cholesterol. They said, let's bypass the surrogate, let's see what we really care about. Because why do we care about cholesterol in the first place? Because we're afraid it's going to tell us something about how long we're going to live. And that's why we are worried about it. So they said, let's look at the thing we're really worried about. Do people die more when they eat more saturated fat? And the results of 350,000 people who were looked at in these studies, in this meta-analysis, was no, it does not cause any increase in death whatsoever. It may involve a little bit of an increase in total cholesterol, but who cares? The endpoint you care about, which is mortality, is not influenced by saturated fat intake. It's that simple.
Saturated fat has been the biggest thing for many, many years. The Heart Association came out with a statement in, I believe it was June of 2017, stating that we should really stay away from saturated fat, and they've been saying this for 50 years. I think they decreased the percentage from 10% to 7%. And a lot of us in integrative medicine really don't believe that. First of all, it is based on studies, 3 studies from the 60s. And the studies are thought to be flawed. And there are many studies since then that show that saturated fat is not nearly as bad or the culprit that we once thought it was.
The myth that's been out there since the 60s is that saturated fats cause coronary heart disease and myocardial infarction and heart attacks. Turns out that's probably not the whole story. Saturated fats, just like a lot of things, is not one entity. It's different entities. And the difference in most saturated fats relates to what's called a chemical carbon length. So it's like how long is your rope? Now, do you have a short rope? We would call that a carbon 4 length versus a long rope, which would be like a carbon 18 length. So it's how many carbon molecules are lined up. So a saturated fat is not just a saturated fat. It depends on the length of the rope, how many carbons. And the newest data shows that if your carbon length is a C10 or less as a saturated fat, does not cause coronary heart disease, does not cause heart attack. If your carbon length is C12 to C18, those saturated fats can cause coronary heart disease. So when you say don't eat saturated fats, the first question I would say to you is, Well, let's get rid of the ones that C12 or higher, but keep the ones that are C10 or less. And we can do that with dietary restriction. The longer chain saturated fats would be in what I would say bad meat. So you're getting like a beef that's been corn-fed, that is not organic, and it's not the meat that's the problem, it's the fats that are in the meat that are the problem. So if you got corn-fed beef versus grass-fed beef that's organic, different type of saturated fats in the beef, as well as different types of other fats in the beef. So they're totally different, literally animals, with what you're eating. Butter is a mixed story too, depending on where the butter comes from. You know, what's the cow eating to make the butter? So if you have a cow that's, you know, consuming a lot of omega-3s and grass, the butter is totally different than if it's being fed corn. So once again, you can't say that all butter is bad either. Some butter is fine.
Saturated fat brings a lot to the table. Some of the longer chain fats, however, it's been incriminated that these longer, very long chain fatty acids, can be inflammatory. I look at it this way. I like eating fat. And, will I eat coconut? Yes, I will, despite the fact that maybe some of my colleagues, will throw coconut under the bus. I look at it this way. Fats do not elicit an insulin response. In other words, they don't elicit the insulin response that sugar does. And to me, being in this business for decades, it's sugar that's the enemy for coronary artery disease. So if you want to eat more fat, whether it's monounsaturated, omega-3, saturated fats, that's okay with me. If you want to have eggs, that's okay with me, as long as they're organic eggs. But I'll tell you, I just feel that we've thrown fat under the bus, and to me, if you ate more healthier fat, and again, I'm a big proponent of olive oil. To me, olive oil is the secret sauce of the Mediterranean diet. I mean, even in the Predemed study, they showed that if you had 4 tablespoons of olive oil a day, that's a lot of olive oil. I mean, that's a lot. I mean, that's like 500 calories or so. I mean, that's pretty hefty stuff. But these participants who took 4 tablespoons of olive oil a day had less heart disease, less heart attack, less death, less Alzheimer's disease, less memory disorders, less diabetes. So there's something about olive oil in a diet. And if you look at the Mediterranean basin, and if you compare the Mediterranean basin to Okinawa, Okinawa has the longest, well, I would say the longest living peoples in the world. I think it's 85.7 years. And the Mediterraneans are only a couple of months behind the Okinawans. And I believe that, the Okinawans eat a lot of seaweeds. That's really good. They eat a lot of artichoke, a lot of avocados. That's really good. Artichokes are really good. But the Mediterraneans, they're eating olive oil. And I feel that olive oil, you talk about cholesterol. I mean, olive oil lowers LDL, raises HDL, lowers triglycerides, have a beneficial effect on blood sugar. I mean, olive oil does everything right to the blood chemistries. And the biggest thing about olive oil that was like music to my ears, because my last name is Sinatra and I love olive oil. But when I read a study where olive oil took pro-inflammatory genes that we all have and changed pro-inflammatory genes back to their non-inflammatory state, that to me was a secret sauce of the Mediterranean diet. And that is the reason why I believe Mediterraneans, live a long time in the world. And if you look at a culture, there are more centenarians in the Mediterranean basin than the entire world. And the Mediterranean basin shares olive oil, whether you're in Libya or Spain or the island of Crete or Tunisia or Greece or Italy. There's something common about that basin, and I believe it's the anti-inflammatory aspects of olive oil.
We just heard from cardiologist Dr. Sinatra explain the importance of fats, such as olive oil. And previously, Dr. Houston explained that saturated fat from grass-fed dairy, such as butter and meat, is not bad for heart disease. The topic of saturated fat is such an important one that I decided to call nutritionist and Dr. Stephen Masley, and I asked him if he thinks saturated fat is bad or not.
Most of the recent information and research and published studies have showed it's pretty neutral. That in moderate doses, not excess, but in a modest amount of intake on a daily basis, probably doesn't have much impact on heart disease. So I'm not asking someone to go eating, steak 3 times a day and eggs and cheese and butter. And I think that's probably excessive. But the idea that we have to really focus on avoiding, I think, is a mistake. The number one cause for heart disease is sugar, and that includes flour, since it has almost the same glycemic load. So I wish we emphasized less on saturated fat and more on avoiding sugar and flour if we really want to help prevent heart disease.
Okay, so do some people respond differently to eating saturated fat?
That probably is the case, that there are, people who are genetically and biologically unique and have special responses. And, some people they can eat everything properly and their cholesterol is off the chart. So, but that's 5% of the population. So for that 5%, probably maybe that saturated fat is moderately important for them. For the other 95%, I think it's probably fairly neutral.
I see. And are there any side effects of a low-fat diet?
You may know this, but I used to be the medical director for the Pritikin Longevity Center back in the 90s. And that was an low-fat diet. And it did drop people's hormone levels, like testosterone levels would drop. I thought some of their cholesterol profile findings got worse. They were more prone to their blood sugar levels going up, impacting insulin and other hormones that regulate blood sugar. So I'm not a fan of low-fat diets.
Can you tell me about the findings of the Sydney Heart Study?
So in the Sydney Heart Study, this is a question we've been asking a long time, looking at vegetable oils, specifically linoleic acid. And, if we give this specific essential fatty acid to people in a big dose, compared to saturated fat, what would be the outcome of that? And they did in Sydney, they did a study and they randomized and compared it. And when they cut the saturated fat in favor of linoleic acid, like that's what we get from corn oil and safflower oil, the risk for heart attack went up.
Now, the consensus around fat is that there are good fats and there are bad fats, and there are ones in the middle that are in debate. So the good fats are well agreed upon. Monounsaturated fat, olive oil, nuts and seeds, and omega-3 fats. There's no argument there. In fact, a large Mediterranean study was done called the PREDIMED study, looking at giving people either olive oil or nuts and comparing that to a group that had a low-fat diet. It was this large randomized nutrition study, very hard to do, 7,000 people. And they found that those who had the olive oil or the nuts did far better in terms of reducing risk for heart disease than those who had the low-fat diet. In fact, they had to stop the study after 4.8 years because the people on the low-fat diet were dying and it was unethical to continue the study. So those are things like olive oil, nuts, and so forth.
When you ask about heart-healthy foods, this is what I lecture on, actually, in my courses. How we have been so misled, ultimately by sponsorship, resulting in guidelines on our health. The American Heart Association takes in almost $1 billion a year in revenue. A good percentage of that from pharma and from the food companies. So they pay for that heart-healthy logo. And it really goes back, ultimately, think about this, to vegetable oil. So corn oil was one of the original heart-healthy foods, never associated with better health, clearly associated with poorer health, greater heart attacks in those who took the corn oil. And this is simply a way for sponsorship to the American Heart Association to ultimately sell more products. This is basically the idea that you consume anything that's from a vegetable and it'll be healthy. So grains, vegetables, therefore, must be healthy. Corn oil must be healthy because it doesn't have saturated fat. All of these products, which are given the seal of being heart healthy, they've consistently been shown to, at best, be neutral, and at worst, to be very unhealthy.
You know, it's funny. Kristen Lawless just wrote a book called Formerly Known as Food, where she talks about those little heart-healthy symbols and this is the cereal of the Olympics and all that stuff. Those are bought. You have to pay quite a lot of money for that. I think she has the figures in there for the American Heart Association. I think it's $3,000 an endorsement, and they have hundreds and hundreds of companies like that. And it's literally a source of millions of dollars for the American Heart Association. Those labels are the silliest things in the world. And they give them heart-healthy labels if they meet the criteria that are outdated. Like, is it low in cholesterol? Who cares? That has nothing to do with anything. Even Ansel Keys knew that. Is it low in saturated fat? Well, when they're just judging on that, then they can give a heart-healthy label to a sugar-coated cereal because it doesn't have any saturated fat and doesn't have any cholesterol. And that's what they do.
You know, we're often told that you must eat grains for their fiber and B vitamins. This is complete fiction. When you consume grains, numerous nutritional deficiencies appear. And we see that even with traditional or heirloom forms like the einkorn wheat, because there's evidence for iron deficiency anemia and other forms of deficiency. So when humans added the seeds of grasses, and we did so, by the way, in desperation during times of starvation, it did keep us alive for a few more weeks, but then we paid the price later. It could be called rheumatoid arthritis, or knee arthritis, or eczema, or cataracts, or in the modern age, type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, psoriasis, migraine headaches, plantar fasciitis, on and on and on. Hundreds of health conditions, all derived from this awful, awful advice to cut your fat, eat more healthy whole grains.
Yeah, so our dietary guidelines in the US often shape guidelines around the world. And they've evolved over time, and originally they were developed by this man named Mark Hegstead, who was a professor at Harvard, who realized that saturated fat was bad, based on the work of Ansel Keys, and that we should be lowering fat and ignoring sugar, and in fact increasing carbohydrate intake. So the first dietary recommendations from the US government were to reduce fat and increase carbohydrate load. That evolved into the dietary pyramid, food pyramid, which showed that we should be eating 6 to 11 servings of bread, rice, cereal, and pasta every day, and only fat sparingly. Now that turned out to be the worst advice in history. In fact, I think it was responsible for millions of deaths related to dietary changes and patterns. The food industry followed suit and produced thousands and thousands of low-fat products like Snackwell cookies, and they were free because they were low-fat. You know, low-fat yogurt is heart healthy, even though there's more sugar per ounce than a can of soda. And these are highly inflammatory, disease-producing foods. So we ended up having this swing to low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets. And now the 2015 dietary guidelines have reversed that for the first time in history and said, no more limit on dietary fat, reduce added sugars, reduce refined carbohydrates, forget about dietary cholesterol. I think that's a great advance. I think they still have ignored data on saturated fat and ignored data on low carbohydrate diets for diabetes and weight loss. And I think in the next iteration in 2020, based on the demand of Congress for a review of their process through the National Academy of Sciences, will change those aspects, and hopefully we'll review the dietary studies on saturated fat as well as on refined carbohydrates and low carbohydrate diets, so we have a more science-informed dietary guidelines.
The food industry really kicked into gear in response to the low-fat, low-saturated fat diet when the US government made it official policy that all Americans had to follow this diet. So that was in 1980. And they told the food industry, the United States Department of Agriculture told the food industry, we need a whole lot of low-fat products. We need you to breed your cattle to be leaner. We want all meat leaner. We want low-fat dairy, and we want thousands of more low-fat products on the shelves in order to serve Americans. And the food industry responded. This is the American Heart Association is sending out pamphlets telling Americans to eat candy, hard candies and gumdrops and pretzels as their snack food because anything was better than consuming any kind of fat. So the food industry responded. The food industry responded by taking fat out of their products. Well, what happens when you take fat out of food? Fat is what provides flavor and texture and stability often in food products. Fat is crucial. Fat is crucial for flavor, conveying flavor. So when you remove fat from products, you have to use what's called in the industry a fat replacer. Fat replacers are almost all carbohydrate based. Usually they're just sugar. So, low-fat salad dressing, low-fat peanut butter, low-fat milk, low-fat cookies, anything that's low-fat is almost inevitably going to be higher in carbohydrates and usually just sugar.
Well, the recommendations of the United States government for low-fat, low-cholesterol foods was a total catastrophe. It led to a further explosion of obesity, further explosion of diabetes, and the sickest generations we've ever seen. And those recommendations are clearly wrong because when you're eating all of those carbs and you're eating certainly all those refined grains, that just leads to a spike in insulin. And insulin is a very interesting hormone that people often think of as storing and regulating blood sugar, but it's also about fat storage. And when you're eating all these heavy carbs and your insulin levels are high, it just socks away all of the fat inside of the fat cells in a one-way key and you can't get them out while insulin's high. Well, insulin will always be high when you're consuming lots of starchy, refined grains. So that's certainly something that I'm against.
The food pyramid, the god-awful food pyramid of the 1992 version, and its later versions like My Plate, which is just a slightly less horrible version of the food pyramid, absolutely came from Ancel Keys' work. And also from lots of politics. And actually there's been books on this. Marion Nestle wrote a great book on food politics, and other people have addressed it. I mean, when you get guidelines from the government, you can be sure that there are millions of dollars being spent by lobbyists for the beef industry, for the dairy industry, for the sugar industry. When they try to change this and say eat less of something, the lobbyists come out of the woodwork and lobby. Don't say eat less, say keep it to 20% of calories. They look for the wording that's going to confuse people and make them think that it's okay to eat their particular thing. So what you get with guidelines is a huge compromise. It's sort of like you've got the Congress together, what can you guys agree on? So there's all kinds of special interests. There's all kinds of big food and all of this stuff kind of working together to make sure that their interests, whatever they make, whether it be dairy or meat or vegetables or grains, unfortunately, vegetables don't have lobbyists, but all the others do. And they're very, very careful about making sure that you're not recommending you consume less of what they have an interest in producing.
One of the great problems we have in nutritional information is that a lot of the advice given to us by official sources like the USDA, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, their information largely comes from what are called observational studies. That is, not studies where we randomize people to treatment versus placebo. Observational studies, we just look at people, ask them things like, Mary, what did you eat last Monday? Write it down. What did you eat last Tuesday? And then we try to predict heart disease, say 10 or 20 years later, or diabetes or cancer or whatever. It is a miserably unreliable way to obtain information about health. So we have a world constructed on garbage data. Observational data is as good as no data at all. Yet this is the basis for national nutritional policy.
Most industrial countries have nutrition food policy that was written by attorneys and politicians, not by scientists. And because grain is a primary crop, and the government in the United States, at least, we subsidize the growth of grain. We take taxpayer dollars to grow the grain. That was originally done during the Great Depression to prevent starvation. But even yet today, we give massive quantities of tax-subsidized dollars to these big corporations like Monsanto to grow their genetically modified foods in mass, and we say that everyone should be eating these foods. And they're on the top of the food guide pyramid as the most important thing to consume, even though there's no scientific evidence that says that's the case.
So when the US government decided that all of Americans should follow a low-fat diet, reduced in saturated fat and cholesterol, there was no data on women and children at all. They had data on men that showed that that diet did not work, that was being ignored at the time. There was no data at all on women and children. They were just assumed to be like men, even though large studies, such as the Framingham study, had demonstrated that women develop heart disease in a very different way than men do. It was a different etiology in the way that women get heart disease compared to men, but those differences were just ignored. It was considered too complicated, they didn't have enough data on women, and it was considered just prudent to start treating children in the fight against heart disease as young as possible. It was thought that was the public health emergency number one. Let's prioritize fighting heart disease from the earliest age, from age 7 or 8, which completely ignores the idea that children might need different nutrition, better nutrition to grow, right? And here they are being given a diet of elimination meant for men to prevent heart disease. So, children need more fat, more protein. They're growing, their bodies are growing. They need to not be eliminating food groups or reducing fat for a public health agenda that has to do with middle-aged men.
What people don't understand about the USDA, and by the way, folks, I'm not making this up, please look on Wikipedia, it's all there. The USDA had two mandates in its charter when it was founded. The two mandates were, number one, to inform the American people about nutrition so that people would be able to eat the most healthy diet possible. The second mandate was to protect and expand the United States agricultural industry. Now, this is kind of like telling tobacco. You've got two missions. Get everybody off cigarettes so that they don't have lung cancer and make more Philip Morris. It just doesn't work. U.S. agriculture is based on basically 5 crops: wheat, corn, soybeans. Those are the 3 top ones. They're the problem in the American diet. If they were being honest, they tell us to eat less of that, but they can never do that because their mandate is to expand and protect American agriculture. Well, what if what American agriculture is making us sick, fat, tired, and depressed? How do you reconcile those two mandates? You don't. And so you wind up with the guidelines.
So as far as the perspective on saturated fat causing heart disease, this has been studied so extensively, and there's this clash in science, which continues to this very day, which is the belief that saturated fat, which is the fat primarily found in animal products and in tropical oils, will clog the arteries. And you see this becomes philosophical because then you actually find the vegetarians will demonize the saturated fat and say it causes heart disease in people who eat meat. And when you actually look at the research very carefully, you see that there's very little support, if any, that saturated fat is harmful. This primarily came out of the work of Ancel Keys, the 1950s and 60s, in which he used data to basically support his philosophy that saturated fat was unhealthy. He became a very strong proponent of this idea and then became a director in the American Heart Association, which has continued to perpetuate this myth that saturated fat is unhealthy. And so what you see is vegetable oil is seen as healthy, animal fat is seen as unhealthy, and there's been a clash now for decades. Ancel Keys' work was truly atrocious. It was clearly very biased in his belief that fat was unhealthy. He disregarded so much research, showing that clearly the cause of obesity, the cause of heart disease, ultimately can be seen as related to carbohydrates, and specifically excess consumption of sugar. So that continued with the sugar industry basically paying so many of the researchers to specifically demonize saturated fat. Researchers at Harvard University were explicitly paid to demonize saturated fat and minimize the harms of sugar.
The only support for the idea that coconut oil is pure poison comes from statistics. which are, so easy to manipulate. These epidemiological surveys and studies that are super easy to manipulate, they can get them to say whatever they want. But if you ever take the trouble to track back any one of those articles to the articles that it references, to the original studies that were done, the correlations between saturated fat and heart attacks, the foundation upon which the entire theory is not sound whatsoever. Because if you look at that, it doesn't say what the articles that cite those articles says it says. In other words, they misstate the case. They basically just assume no one's going to ever look back at those articles and read them carefully enough to see, hey, wait a second, this citation with this little number 27 here from so-and-so study that said, saturated fat correlates with heart disease. When you look that study up, you often see it citing another study. And when you track it all the way back to the beginning, you don't see that it's supporting the statement. So it's smoke and mirrors. And this is what I mean by they've weaponized science.
And a lot of problems is with these low-fat diets. What's happening is we have 4 main taste buds, sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. But they're finding we may even have taste buds on our tongue for fat. So when they're taking fat away from a lot of foods and making it so-called healthy, they're taking away that taste as well. And to substitute that taste, they're then adding a lot of salt and sugar to make up for it. So that's another reason why low-fat diets are creating a lot of problems, because of the added salt and sugar, which then can affect our blood pressure, blood sugar levels, create more inflammation, lead to diabetes, and then increase incidence of heart disease as well.
What I found in my research was in America in the early 1800s, so more than 200 years ago, Americans were eating about 50 to 60% more meat than we do today. So when people say, wow, we eat so much more red meat than we used to, that's really not true if you look at the broader scope of history. It's also true that in the US, and I think it's true in other countries as well, but in the US, since the government has told us to cut back on meat, Americans have really complied. It shocked me to look at the data to see that Americans have reduced their consumption of red meat since 1970 by 28%, and beef by 35%. So we have complied with those guidelines according to the best government data that we have.
I think it's important to understand that we have drastically changed the nature of the fat that we eat over the past 50 years. And as we have, we've gotten sicker and sicker. So ever since we heard this idea that saturated fat was bad, we need to avoid animal fat, we actually have done that. So when you talk to people who say, well, animal fat is bad, it causes heart attacks, we need to eat less, I think it's important to point out that we no longer eat very much animal fat. In America, 80% of a person's fat calories are coming from vegetable oils. It used to be the case that 80% was coming from animal fat, but we flipped it. So we actually have done exactly what we were supposed to do. We've started eating more fat and more fat and more fat from vegetable oils. We're not eating more fat than we were. It's a higher percentage of vegetable fat. If you think about it, when you go shopping and if you wanted to get animal fat, it'd be hard. Because in America, most of the chicken is skinless. Most of the meat is cleaned of the fat. They trim the fat. Most of the burger is 90% fat-free. Most of the dairy products are fat-free dairy products. It's hard to find full-fat plain yogurt. Even sour cream and cottage cheese, there's like low fat of that. We've gone from a country of people who used to get 80% of our fat calories from animal fat to people now who get 80% of our fat calories from vegetable fat. So we have done that. And as we've done that, we have failed to solve any problem, and we've gotten sicker and sicker. Now we have more heart attacks, more strokes, more obesity, more diabetes. And worse than that, we have brain diseases in adults and children. We have autoimmune diseases in adults and children. And we have all these diseases as we've been doing exactly what the experts told us to do. Eat less animal fat and eat more vegetable fat.
I think the low-fat diet movement is probably one of the most dangerous social-wide, countrywide. In the U.S., the entire country, the American Heart Association and other groups have adopted this policy of low-fat diets to reduce the risk of developing heart disease. And again, I'm a big fan of empirical data. Here we have low-fat diets, low-fat products, high carbohydrate-based diets, and we see more heart disease, not less heart disease. So to me, that says that something is at the very least wrong with that advice. Maybe it's that low-fat diets are too aggressive, right? I mean, if we look at what fat is important to do, fat is an important structure. Fat's a precursor for our hormones. Fat is the substance that surrounds every cell membrane in our body. There are certain types of fats, like omega-3 fatty acids, for example, EPA and DHA, that actually prevent heart disease. They prevent inflammation. They actually nourish the brain. 60% of the brain is fat. And there's a type of omega-3 fat called DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, that nourishes brain cells and helps with brain communication. So all these people that are being told to go on these low-fat diets, eat these low-fat products, they're vastly deficient in fat-soluble nutrition, like omega-3 fats, but they're also vastly deficient in fat-soluble vitamins, because we get fatty vitamins. Remember, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K are fat. And these are found in fatty foods. So if we avoid fatty foods on purpose, we're actually creating a dietary restriction that could lead potentially to a number of problems. If we think about the function of vitamin A, one of the functions of vitamin A is in hormone production. One of the functions of vitamin A is in the repair of the gut lining. So vitamin A deficiency can cause gastric reflux, and it can cause leaky gut and intestinal permeability. Vitamin A deficiency can cause bone loss, and it can cause reproductive endocrinology types of problems. Vitamin D deficiency has been linked to heart disease directly. It's been linked to 19 different forms of terminal cancer. It's been linked to autoimmune disease. We know vitamin D deficiency increases the risk for the development of lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis. So these are very dangerous diseases, and we have this diet policy that is universal that says avoid foods that contain these nutrients. And to me, that's just a very, very dangerous blanket policy.
So you're asking about the Women's Health Initiative, which is a large number of women in nursing careers, who one very important finding they found was that those that consume the most saturated fat actually had the lowest rate of cancer. And in fact, you find the people who consume the most saturated fat overall were healthy. So that actually was a very important trial in showing that consumption of fat ultimately resulted in a reduction in adverse health outcomes.
The Women's Health Initiative was the largest ever clinical trial ever undertaken in nutrition science. It was on nearly 49,000 women in the US in different centers around the country. And after almost 8 years on that diet, a low-fat diet, the women were found to that had no benefit for fighting obesity, type 2 diabetes, no benefit for fighting cardiovascular disease, and no benefit for fighting any kind of cancer. So it was an overall complete failure of the low-fat diet to prevent disease. But I want to say, in the group of clinical trials that look specifically at saturated fat, where instead of butter, they had margarine, instead of regular meat, they had soy-filled meat and soy-filled milk and soy-filled cheese. They tried to replace saturated fats with these unsaturated corn oil, soybean oil. In those trials, on tens of thousands of people all over the world, the results were that switching out saturated fat for unsaturated fat had no effect on your risk of dying from heart disease. So in all those trials, not only did switching saturated fat for vegetable oils not help fight your risk of heart disease, the people eating more corn oil and soybean oil, they found in nearly a dozen of these experiments that they died at higher rates of cancer. This was an unexplained side effect of this cholesterol-lowering diet. And they couldn't explain it, but there was great concern about it, such that the National Institutes of Health had a series of high-level expert panel meetings in Washington, D.C. to try to figure out, well, what was going on with this side effect of cancer? And they could never explain it. You know, was it the cholesterol lowering? Was it the fact that the vegetable oils had some, you know, gave people cancer or stimulated cancer, but they could never figure out what the answer was.
And so this way, you could have a fat-free product. Have you ever seen a cube of sugar? Fat-free, baby. You know, however, it's super high in calories. It's going to cause tissue damage, which causes inflammation, and it can elevate cholesterol because it's pure processed sugar with no healthy minerals, and your body is going to tax the pancreas and damage the system. And we're eating pounds of this stuff. So it's the low-fat, low-cholesterol craze is really just for marketing. It has nothing to do with health.
We're often told that we should prefer complex carbohydrates, long-chain carbohydrates, like whole grains, over simple sugars, like sucrose or fructose, because conventional advice says that complex carbohydrates aren't as unhealthy as simple sugars. They have more B vitamins, fibers, and don't raise blood sugar the same. None of that is true. What they've failed to recognize is that the complex carbohydrate of wheat and grains is amylopectin A. Amylopectin A is uniquely susceptible to digestion. That's because we have an enzyme called amylase in our saliva and in the stomach, and it's very effective at degrading or breaking down amylopectin A into glucose, sugar. That's why if I take a piece of bread, whole or white, put it in my mouth, my blood sugar goes way up because it already started digestion right here. So the amylopectin A of wheat and related grains is highly digestible. And that's why 2 slices of whole wheat bread raises blood sugar higher than 6 teaspoons of table sugar. So we've been given advice to cut fat, cut saturated fat, move more, eat less, and include plenty of healthy whole grains. That is a surefire path to weight gain, type 2 diabetes, and other common health conditions.
The Boeing studies were 2 studies done in Seattle in Boeing employees, the Boeing aircraft company, and it was to test the low-fat diet, like the Women's Health Initiative. There was an understanding that everybody was being told to eat a low-fat diet since the 1970s, but actually there was no data on it. It had never been tested in any clinical trials. So Robert Knopp decided to do these Boeing studies in the late 1990s, 20 years after Americans had already been put on a low-fat diet. Finally, it was tested. He went and he put hundreds of men and then hundreds of women, 2 separate trials, to see how the low-fat diet affected them. If you lowered fat, he had them in this trial, in the Boeing trial, he had some on a low-fat diet, some on an extra low-fat diet, some on a super-duper low-fat diet, and what he found was that it didn't benefit health in any way. And the more you lowered your fat, the worse your health looked in terms of cardiovascular risk. The more you reduced your fat, the more your triglycerides would go up, the more your HDL, your good cholesterol, would drop. Both of those are signs of worsening cardiovascular risk. So when I interviewed the project leader for the Boeing studies, he said when his results came out, that was literally, his results showed that the low-fat diet that Americans had been told to eat already for decades, that diet was actually increasing cardiovascular risk. When his results came out, he said that nobody was interested. It was like a silent study. Nobody asked him a question, he got no press coverage, there was 0 interest in his results. And you know, this was a study funded by the National Institutes of Health, a rigorous, good study, and yet its results were just completely ignored.
"20 years ago, I was diagnosed with a disease called familial hypertriglyceridemia. which means that I had extraordinarily high levels of fat in my blood. I also had extremely low HDL, which is the good cholesterol. That combination put me at extremely high risk for developing heart disease. I followed a low-fat diet recommended by the American Heart Association. I listened to my doctor. He expressed a lot of concern about my abnormal cholesterol and triglycerides. And for 10 years, I exercised, I followed a low-fat diet, and all that happened was I gained weight and my triglycerides just went higher. So 10 years ago, again, my doctor emphasized that I was at such high risk for developing heart disease, and he urged me to go on a statin. He said, you've got to get your cholesterol down, you've got to get your triglycerides down. So I knew a lot about the brain, but very little about heart disease. So I decided, well, I've got a PhD in biology. The least I can do is read a few papers and find out what are these triglycerides that are putting me at such high risk. And the first paper that I read made it so clear that what's happening is that sugar is converted into fat. Sugar is converted into triglycerides. So what was clear was the demon on my plate, which I had learned, was the sugar, was the carbs. I was eating too much bread, too much potatoes. So I started learning more about this. I started cutting back on carbs, reduced the carbs. Over the years, my triglycerides plummeted, dropped 75% without any medication. My good cholesterol, the HDL, increased by 25%. So I've been able to improve my biomarkers. I'm no longer at high risk for developing heart disease. So for me, this has been a very personal journey. I've been able to improve my health. I've lost about 25 pounds. I'm now in good shape. So I've dramatically reduced, almost completely eliminated grains. I eat very little bread, cut out cereals, and that's been able to help me to be able to lose weight and feel better. I realized there's absolutely no need to consume grains. I've been able to enjoy having the high-fat diet and not worry about consuming saturated fat, because the hard research, when you look closely at it, you see there's absolutely no good evidence that consumption of saturated fat in the context of a low-carb diet is not harmful whatsoever.
I hope you enjoyed the first episode of the Untold story of heart disease. There are 8 more episodes yet to come, where we tackle some big topics, such as high cholesterol and blood pressure, statin drugs, food addiction, diabetes, and also reveal the true cause of heart disease. Coming up next, we tackle one of the most misunderstood topics of all when it comes to heart disease, cholesterol. I'll see you in the next episode, and thanks for watching.
If you really want to know why heart disease rates all over the world are skyrocketing and what you can do to prevent it, then why not join our Heart Disease Code program today? The program is the most comprehensive heart disease prevention program anywhere. Included in the program is the 9 Steps to Fight and Prevent Heart Disease book, which covers many important topics such as high blood pressure, cholesterol, heart attacks, strokes, erectile dysfunction, and more. Plus, get full access to the Untold story of heart disease documentary series. The series contains over 10 hours of interviews with more than 40 natural health experts, including world-leading cardiologists, doctors, scientists, and researchers who reveal how to fight and prevent heart disease. Each episode comes with a companion guide with short quizzes to accelerate your learning, along with dozens of delicious recipes, our top 50 foods for heart health, and a guide for the best supplements to take and what test you should ask your doctor for. All this and more can be yours just by clicking the link in the description below.